We're going to be looking at four particular themes as we look at this psalm. Known by God, that we can be pursued by God, made by God, and intimacy with God. So I'm letting that a little bit out of the bag at the beginning so that you'll know that that's what we're going to be talking about, and I'm giving you ample time, hopefully, to get there to Psalm 139. But before we start reading, I do want to talk about that's what this psalm is about. This psalm is about that God can know me, that I can know Him, that I can have a relationship with Him. And we talk a lot about that, right? And if you've been to church or known any Christians, they talk about, hey, you can have a personal relationship with Jesus. And it's almost become cliche, but really this psalm goes into the depths of what that is and what that means. And it does a great, masterful, poetic way of doing that. But first I want to talk about the problem of that. The reality of that is that we have difficulty being intimate. We have difficulty finding connections with people. Some people say that one of the reasons that we have difficulty with this is because of technology. You probably noticed, everybody's usually like this, walking around, okay, especially if they're trying to find Pokemons or something, and they're walking around with their phones, and they won't look at people in the eye. They're just constantly on these devices. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with that. Some of you may be using it right now to look up Psalm 139. You can have the Bible app, and it's a wonderful tool, okay? It's not only used for texting, but sometimes you can actually put it to your ear and actually talk to people. If you didn't know that, that's one of the functions about it. Sometimes I have to remind people, like, they want me to text them, like, this long conversation, and I text back, can I just call you? Like, you put this thing to your ear, and we can talk about it. It's really fascinating. Nowhere that you go in the world today are people not without technology. I was just in Mexico this week. I had to be in Mexico City for a conference, and whether we were in the city of Mexico where it was really, like, let's say the most tourist area, like the busiest area where people were very rich, or then we went to an area that was very, very poor. People barely had, drinkable water. Everybody had a cell phone. Every single person. And I remember telling my wife, I said, these people don't even have, good drinking water, and they have satellite television and cell phones. Every single kid. I was just like blown away by how wired and connected we are as a world. And that's everywhere worldwide. And one of the things that people say that happens with the technology is it has become so infused and so commonplace. It's kind of like one of those things that just because we could, we did it, but we didn't think about whether we should, okay? Because one interesting thing about, technology when it was not that available is that it forced you to not be with it all the time. Some of you remember actually having to walk over to the phone and use it and put it down, and so you had to walk away from it, and it always wasn't with you. So, God forbid, you had to have interaction with other people. In fact, some of you may have seen this. It says, sure, I'd love to come over and hang out with you while you talk and text with other people on your phone the entire time. Wouldn't that be great? What happened to us? In fact, a friend of mine was talking about his daughter had invited a friend over. They were sitting on the same couch, and they were on their phones the whole time, and then they were on an app where they were talking to each other. Some of you laugh, but this is like a real thing, like young people do. They'll come over to somebody's house, they'll hang out, get on the phone, and while they're on their phones, they're on apps where they are texting to each other and talking to each other, even though they are literally physically next to each other. And it's just like, you're pulling my leg, right? People do this. But then I remembered, that some of us do this. Hi, honey, how are you? Great, let me just text this text real quick. Okay, wonderful. Even us adults do this, right? We just got to get in that one quick text or that one quick note or that one quick email before we even kiss our wives or kiss our husbands or kiss our kids. We're so wired. And so we're so wired in connecting technology, but we've lost the sense of connection to each other. Many people say that even though it was meant to be something that was supposed to be helpful, in fact, just recently the anniversary of the internet was celebrated. And the guy who made it as obviously as a tool, right, to connect all of us, the World Wide Web. We're supposed to have access to one another. But now, even though we have access to each other, we don't even really know each other. And that's what this psalm is talking about. In fact, Donald William puts it this way. He says, our lack of intimacy with each other comes from a lack of intimacy with God. And that's a very powerful statement that we're going to unpack this morning in this psalm. Because that's really, at the end of the day, that's the crux of it. Because the reality is this. I want you, for example, to think about the 10 Commandments. Just even in the 10 Commandments, the first 4 commandments have to do with my relationship with God. And they come in that order because the reality is I can't get right with you. I know that I shouldn't steal, that I shouldn't murder, I shouldn't fornicate, I shouldn't, lie. But those things are hard to do if I don't even do the first four, if I don't put God first, if I don't take his name in vain, if I don't take his Sabbath holy. If I can't do the first four things, I can't even do the rest of the six. And that's the way we were wired. We talk about being wired to each other, but we were wired by God to be intimate with him first. And as Donald Williams says here, because we don't have that intimacy with him, it's really hard to do that with one another. So let's get into it a little bit. Let's look at the first 5 verses in Psalm 139. You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You're familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. You hem me in behind and before, and you laid your hand upon me. And then verse 6, I also want to read, such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. After the psalmist, who is David, thinks about all this, he's like, man, this is like, if we were to put it in modern words, this is blowing my mind. He's saying, it's too lofty. I can't even imagine this. Why? What's he talking about? He's saying, you know my thoughts. You know what I'm thinking. You discern. Even before a word is about to go out of my lips, you already know what's going on. So it's not just that God has knowledge about what's in our head and knowledge about us, but he knows our thoughts, our motives, and our agendas, our emotional sense of what we're thinking. The things that we tell no one. Ooh. See, we can fool everybody, right? We can come Sunday morning, hey, how are you doing? Everything is great. We can put a mask on. We can fool our friends. We can fool our families. We can tell everybody everything is fine. But in that quiet of the very early morning, or in that quiet of the very late evening, when we're just alone with our thoughts, that's who we really are. And it's that person that God knows. It's that person that God knows their thoughts, their motives, and agendas, the schemes that we have going on, that we think no one knows, that we're continually breaking these commandments, that we're scheming to lie to this person, that we're scheming to steal from that one, that we're scheming to do this that we're not supposed to do. It's that God knows about us, the things that we don't say that no one could really know. And if people knew, oh my goodness. And I speak from personal experience because I'm a sinner, just like you are. I don't put myself above you. And if people knew, man, what I was thinking, oh, Lord have mercy. Just like any of us would think that. But the reality is God knows those very thoughts, those very agendas, those very emotions. And the psalmist says, this is just too amazing for me. This is too wonderful for me. But see, God is the only one who knows us like that. And in fact, he says in the first verse, he says those exact words. He says, you have searched me, Lord, and you know me. That phrase, you know me, is what we in English talk about knowing someone in the biblical sense. Okay? You know what I mean by knowing someone in the biblical sense? Okay, I know there's a couple kids in here, but not too many. So when you get married, you're not really married until you know your wife in the biblical sense. Because to know that means what? In the very beginning in Genesis, when it says that God made Eve for Adam and they were together, it says Adam knew his wife. That phrase, to know, it means to know somebody in an intimate, personal way. That's why the Bible says that sexual relationships are so important, because what happens in sex is that you are growing in an intimate, personal way, that you are becoming literally one flesh, and your spirits are being joined because it's such a beautiful union that you should only do it with one person, that one person that you commit to being with the rest of your life. That's why it's so painful that if you were with other people and you're with multiple people, because every time you're giving away a piece of yourself, every single time. And it's not, it's only made to be that one knowing when they know you. And David is saying right here, he says, God, you know me that way. You know me in the way like my wife knows me, is what David is saying. Right? And how is that? It's like, when you guys look at your wives who are here in the room, and your wife looks at you, and she's like, and you're like, yes. And she's like, you know, and you're like, I don't know. And she's like, you know, you're supposed to know. I'm like, how am I supposed to know? I don't read minds. And she's like, you're supposed to know. And we're like, well, we're not psychic. But our wives expect us to know. Why? Because they have this union with us, and they're like, want to share this link with us that has no expressions, and we as men are dumbfounded because we don't work like that. And so we're like, what's going on here? But there are things you know. I've seen this happen. I don't know if you've had this experience. I've had it with my wife where you just look at each other and you have this like psychic conversation. Like, you see him, what he's doing, right? Yeah, I see what he's doing. Yeah, he's going to go for that extra candy. Yes, he is. He's supposed to know. This whole conversation is happening without words, right? And it's, how do we do that? How do we have that close union with somebody? Well, because we have made a bond with this person, with our spouses. We've made a bond with them that only can this person truly know me. And what David says here in the first verse, he says, you know me. That's how you know me. When we say that phrase, you know that phrase, only God knows? That's not a joke. Only God really knows you in the way that you can be truly known. Not even your wife knows you that way. And so he says, you perceive my thoughts, you discern them, you know before a word is known, and that's how close God is to us. So then the psalmist kind of shifts and says, well, if he knows me that well, and he knows everything, where can I go? Follow me, verse 7. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you're there. If I made my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, I set on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me, and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, and for darkness is as light to you. The logical conclusion, typically when someone knows us really well, is we have this kind of like what psychologists call fight or flight syndrome, right? We either are going to fight it or we're going to get away from it. Typically, our main thing to do with God has been to flee. Because it's really uncomfortable that someone knows us that well, when someone knows us that well. We either fight it or we flee. And so, but the psalmist is saying, this is ridiculous. Where can I go? I go to heaven, you're there. If I go to the depths of, he's talking about hell, you're there. If I go as far as the sea, the land, where could I possibly go that God is not? And we all know this, right? This is like basic knowledge, right? We talk about him being omnipresent. He is everywhere. And that's not a joke. I mean, you can go to another country, meet some other believers. Guess what? God is there. You can go to this place and that day. He is there and he is everywhere. He's saying, but notice how he phrases this, where can I go? In other words, where can I hide from you? It's a very simple answer. It's nowhere. Okay? It's just that he puts it in poetic terms because it's very beautiful. But what I find astounding about this is it's talking about the darkness. He says to himself in verse 11, surely the darkness will hide me. Isn't that usually a first thought? It's like, hey, I know where I can go. I'll hide in the dark. And that's a very human tendency. Where do we do our worst deeds? We do them in the darkness. It's the reason we light up the night, right? That we have street poles and lamps and we put our lights on at night outside our house because we know people do bad things in the dark. It's always been that way. Since we're little, we play hide and seek, but we're really afraid of the dark. We don't want to go out. We're afraid of the dark. Why? Because we know bad things happen in the dark. They don't happen at light in the day. And when they do happen in the light of the day, we don't know what to do. In fact, for example, like if you look at this news story about a girl being kidnapped, it says in the headline, kidnapping in broad daylight. That's the most shocking thing about this. The most shocking thing about this headline that they're trying to get across to people, and they say it twice, they're like, in broad daylight. Why? Because we know there are bad people who do bad things at night. But man, when they do bad things in the day, we're like, woo! We're like, that guy is really bad. Not only did he want to do it at night, but he went out and did it in the day, right? If somebody carjacked you in the day, you're like, what is going on? Like, you wouldn't even want to go into a city that has a high rate of crimes in the day because you're like, man, there's no fear. You thought about that? There's no fear. Someone who is willing to do that in the day is not even afraid. Because truly, in reality, we're afraid, and that's why we do our deeds in the dark. Because we know what? God's watching. We know what's right and we know what's wrong. And we know someone is watching, and so we want to hide. And the psalmist says, that's ridiculous. To you, Surely the darkness behind me, the light might come around me. He says, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day. It's just utter foolishness. But we have been doing this from day one. In Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve sinned, what does the Bible say in Genesis chapter 3? It says this, then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. So they're waiting for what? The cool of the day, when the sun's starting to set. It's getting what? Getting dark. In the cool of the day, they hid from the Lord among the trees. Why the trees? Because that's where the shade is, where the darkness is. But the Lord God called to man and says, where are you? We've been doing this from the beginning. We haven't stopped doing it, and it's utter ridiculousness. Here are two people who were as close to God as you could possibly be. They literally walked with God and spoke with Him. And the moment that they sin, the moment that they're in their shame and in their guilt, they hide from Him. Even though they probably rationally know it's foolish. I mean, you got to imagine, right? God's like, really? They think I can't see through trees? I mean, come on, right? I mean, it's utter foolishness. And you got to understand this, and one of the reasons I love this verse is that I love when God asks a question. Because what did we just read? He knows our thoughts. He knows our motives. He knows our agendas. So if He asks a question, whose benefit is it really for? It's for my benefit. It's for their benefit. It's not that He doesn't know where they are. This question is really packed. It's like, why are you hiding? Why are you doing this? Where are you? Just come out. Just come out. This doesn't make sense. If you think about it, even when you were a child, right? Think about the moment when you were a child and you did something wrong, and you know you did something wrong, and you hear mom and dad calling you. I'll pick on Luby. He's in the first row. Luby, get over here. He's like, he's dragging his head. He knows he's in trouble. What's the first question your parents ask you? What'd you do? Now, as you get older, you realize that's a stupid question. That's a stupid question. They know what I did. I broke this, or I hit my brother, or I did that. They know what I did. Why are they asking me this? And so you're like, oh, I did this. And then your parents punish you. But in that moment when they're asking you, you're struggling, right? You're like, if I lie right now, they're going to know. Because I know that they know that I know. Some of you will get that. And if I tell the truth, I'll still get punished. You're like in this weird zone, but you got to do it because they've called you and they're asking you. But see, it isn't until you have children of your own. You'll get there one day, Luby. When you have children of your own, you're going to get why that happened. Because now when I have my own kids and I called them to me and I'm like, what did you do? I know that I did it because I love them. I'm calling them because I saw what they did. I know what they did. I know what happened. I'm calling them because I love them and they can't hide from me. I know what happened. And if I didn't love them, I wouldn't call them and I wouldn't discipline them. And why do we expect any less from God? He's calling out to us. We can't hide from Him. It's utter foolishness. And like a good father, He calls us to Him and says, what are you doing? What are you up to? And we can't help but just bear and tell the truth. In verses 13, it says this, that God made us. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How is it that God knows us so well? The psalmist says He made us. The person who is the creator knows very well the very thing they made and created. If you've never made anything, you don't get this. Okay, if you've even made a clay pot that wasn't very good, that your parents said was wonderful, then you might get this a little bit. But God is the master workman. He says here what? We were fearfully and wonderfully made. We are a craftsmanship But here's what's amazing. The psalmist is saying we were knit and woven together in minute detail in our mother's womb, even before we even knew what a thought was. That's some scary stuff. That God knows us that well and designed us with that well. He made our quirks, our personalities, our likes and dislikes. He set a path for us. He intimately made us that well. Is there no relationship that's more beautiful than a mother and her child? I got to tell you, because I'm a dad, and as much as my wife competed to see which one my child was going to say first, mama or dada, I mean, I was glad sometimes. I think I won with one and not the other. There is no closer relationship than that bond with a mother and a child. Why? Because that woman had a human being inside of her, cooking for 9 months. Boop, then it came out. I didn't have to do that. In fact, recently there was that quote from Ryan Reynolds. I don't know if you saw that in an interview. The actor, they asked him, hey, do you mind changing the diapers, for the baby that you have now? He says, why would I mind? My wife just put out a human being. She had a human being in her for 9 months. All I got to do is change a diaper. Why would I mind? That was fascinating. It was like people were just like, whoa, a guy is saying that? But most of us, that's the God-honest truth. We, as close as we are, and there is a bond between father and child, there really is. I'm not negating that. But I did not have that creature inside of me. Whatever she ate, he ate, and she ate. I mean, it's just like fascinating. There is no closer bond. And the psalmist is saying in the same way that when a baby is bonded to a mother, man, God knows me that well. In fact, he knows me even better than my own mother. And I can say that because she's not here this morning. He knows us because he designed it all. So what happens to us? We come out of the womb and we don't know anything and we're, just living life and getting to know everyone. And then as things go on, we start to get more and more disconnected, even to the very people that are closest to us. Because we start to be so fractured and so broken. And we don't know how to connect anymore. Listen, a baby doesn't know what to do but to connect. That's all it's living and breathing for when it's a baby, when you and I are just babies. But as we get moving and going along, we think we know stuff. And so we start to drift apart. Recently, there was a psychologist, I can't recall his name. He said that you can have true intimacy in 4 minutes of staring. There's several videos. You can find them on Google. It's a 4-minute experiment where people get together as couples, and they have them stare at each other for 4 minutes. And it's fascinating. I saw several of these videos, and they're absolutely fascinating. They put these strangers together, and total strangers. They're looking at one another, staring, and what happens initially within the first minute is you start giggling, right? Look, stare at your partner right now. You're going to start laughing. You can't help it. Look at them in the face, okay? They're goofy looking, right? Just like I'm goofy looking. You're like, oh my gosh. And you can't help it. You start laughing. It's uncomfortable. What happens is fascinating. After that first minute, within the second to third minute, it gets really quiet of people staring at each other. And that's when the stuff starts to happen. By the 4th minute, people are crying. People are confessing things to each other. It's just like, it's fascinating. For example, there was one of the couples in the video was a married couple. I love this first line that she told him. She's like, don't look at my hair. You can tell they're married, right? She's like, don't look at my hair. Don't look at my makeup. Look at my eyes. He's like, yes, dear. And so they start staring at each other. And eventually, about near the end, about minute 3, he hugs her. And afterward, they interview them. And they asked, okay, how was it? He says, oh, it was really uncomfortable. She talks about how emotional it was. And he says, I can't remember the last time I hugged my wife. Can you imagine that? He said he couldn't remember the last time he hugged his wife. But as he was staring at her face to face and overcome with emotion, that's all he could do. In fact, for some of us, the last time we stared at our wives was when we were like, I do. And then we were like, I'm glad that's over with. When's dinner? Because it's so uncomfortable to look at somebody in the face. Just try it out later, especially if you're married. If you end up having kids, you can call them Juan. It's okay. But just stare at that person. It's so super uncomfortable because something inside of us says, oh, I can't. I become vulnerable when somebody is looking at me intently like that. One of the second couples was a brother and a sister. And I love that because they're siblings. Because you know when you're siblings, I mean, you pick on each other and you fight. So in the first minute, they're like laughing and poking each other and still looking at each other. And then, as you can see here in this picture, she starts to cry. And then she says, you know, when you were really sick, it was really hard for me. And she starts revealing stuff. It's just revealing stuff that she should have said but couldn't say. What is it about this moment that is making these people open up? Well, it's the fact that for the first time, maybe in a long time, somebody's forcing them to look at another human being. That's what the disconnect does of this world. It fractures us so that we don't have to interact with one another, so that we don't have to look at each other. In fact, that's what amusement does. Amusement means to think on something else, to be distracted. So movies and television and music and all these other things, and all those things are very good, don't get me wrong. But in excess, what they do is they numb us to true intimacy. We can't stand to even look at someone because they'll probably start seeing the real me. And as the psalmist thinks about all this, here's what he says at the end of the psalm. If you follow me in verse 23. He says, search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. After having thought about all this, about how God knows us and he's everywhere and he truly made me, and he knows me like no one else, the psalmist just gives up. He's like, that's it. Just search me and know my heart. Just test me. Just fix what's wrong in here and lead me in the way that's right because I know that you know. The psalmist, is David, he's crying out for true intimacy with God because he's finally looking at him. In fact, in the book of James, if you go along with me, and it's near the end of your Bible, phrases it a little bit differently. In James chapter 4, verse 8 through 10, it says this, come near to God, and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, and wail. Change your laughter to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. Why does James say this? He's saying that God desires to be near with us. He wants us to come close to him, and he will come close to us. I remember reading these words when I was a younger man, and I was going through some difficulties, and my family was getting all fractured and dysfunctional, and my father didn't want anything to do with me, and I didn't have a male presence in my life, and I read these words, and it said that God would draw near to me if I drew near to him, and I couldn't understand that. I said, how can that be? God made the heavens, he made the earth, he made the skies and the seas and the volcanoes and all the most powerful things in the universe, and he desires a relationship with me? When my own father doesn't even want to be with me? How can this be? And I must have read this like 10 times. And as I'm reading it and I'm crying, I just can't believe it. But at that moment, as I'm praying and I'm reading these words, it's like I'm staring at God. It's like I'm staring at this cross, and I'm staring at it for 4 minutes. And as I'm staring at this cross for 4 minutes, I'm thinking to myself, that should have been me. As it says here in James, I'm the one that's the sinner. I'm the one that needs to be purified. There's no way I'm as good as I think I am. And the way that God really knows me, and I look at it and I think I should be in that place. And God says that he loves me so much, he would draw close to me and send his son who opens up his arms for me. And he wants to know me. He says, humble yourselves before the Lord and he will lift you up. Those who humble themselves, those who realize that if we would just stare at this cross, that same way in that video, people stare for 4 minutes, just stare at it and realize it's empty because I should have been there, and it's empty because the one who took my place is no longer there. Man, that's humbling. that the person who was there desires a relationship with me, and all I got to do is get on my knees and humble myself, and he will draw near to me? Are you kidding me? It will change your life. And it's not easy. I still struggle with it. It's still hard because our world, it keeps getting in, and we're so fractured. Why is it hard? Because just like I told you, it's hard to stare at somebody. And God's like, stare at me. Look at me. Look at what I did for you. Look at who I am. And it's uncomfortable because the moment that we look at God, we realize we're not as good as we think we are, and we're not as bad and despised as others say we are. And God says, you're a sinner in need of grace and salvation, and I will save you. And God says, others call you despicable, but I will call you a child of God. And I will give you a new name, and I will give you a new life, and I will make you whole. And that's what God desires with us. He desires that intimacy, that vertical relationship. All these other relationships, man, they're important, but you can't get right with other people unless you get right with God. And here's the way that Donald Williams puts it. He says, when we submit to God's work in our lives, we grant him permission to do that which he has already purposed. As God knows David, David will know himself. What's interesting is that we live in a society, in a world where everybody's fighting about their identity and about who they are. But we really don't know who we are because we don't know God. How can we know who we really are and who we're meant to be and what we're supposed to be all about if we don't know the one that made us? And he desires to know us. And so, this is fascinating. If we were to want to truly know who we are, we got to know God. It's as simple as that. We can't find it in other things. We can't find it in other people. No one knows us better than him. And so how can we do that? We read his word. His words right here in this book are his love letter to us. In fact, the psalmist, he's just blown away. He says, this is too lofty for me to attain. And when you've grasped what we're reading this morning, you're going to be like the psalmist. He said, Lord, just test me. Take out all of this anxiousness and lead me in the way everlasting. Just come and save me and fix what's broken. Because when we get real, that's where we really are. When we get real in the quiet of the morning or in the quiet of the evening, when no one's around and all we have is our thoughts, we know how bad we truly are. We know how broken we truly are and how much we're in need of a Savior. And all we got to do is just open up and say, God, like it says here in the Psalms, just search me. You know my heart. Just test me and fix what's broken and lead me on the way everlasting. And as we start to have that intimacy with God, then we can start to have this intimacy we truly desire with one another. Let's pray.